Terry, I've fallen ill.
Either that or you've robbed a bank.
No, I woke up this morning. Well, I woke up several times last night and then again this morning, and I've been stricken with pink eye.
Well, seriously?
Yeah, eyes
I'm,
hurt.
I'm sorry.
I got stuff in them. They're pink. They're sensitive to light. Really, honestly, it's more red. I got red eye.
You can thank your little incubators for that, probably.
Well, the way I know it's pink eye is because the 3-year-old has pink eye, and he touched me in my eyes. I got pink eye. I mean, it's very straightforward. This is not a complex path here.
Yeah.
So I've already been to the doctor. I got the medicine. It's been put in my eyes, but the light sensitivity under my bright studio lights is still a problem for me. Also my eye hurts and is I would say the word for it is gross. My eye is gross.
Well, your eye affliction has caused your audio to be different as well.
Is it too loud?
No, it seems like you've changed your settings. It's tinny and feels like
It might be the wrong mic.
you don't have the Barry White depth to your voice.
Well, I mean, I don't know how to change anything now that I'm in here. So we're gonna go with see how it sounds when it's over, and I'll be Barry White again next time, maybe.
So bank robber aesthetic and new audio. I'm not sure how to handle this.
Well, it all stems from I packed my computer up and went decamped to the beach for a 3-day weekend. So the computer went with me. The child climbed on my head. The pink eye was picked up from daycare and then carried with us for the 3-day weekend. And then because it was 3-day weekend of childcare and going to hike around the beach park and things like that, that was when the eyes and the fingers had a wreck. He was like on my head and he was like grabbing my face like this, and I'm like, well, I'm doomed.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it all clears out ahead of your trip.
Yeah, I'll be okay. I'll be all right in the end. And the other thing is, hoodies are also they also strike me as sort of the consummate startup piece of attire.
This is true. This is
Maybe
very
not with the
true.
hat and the shades. That's more Unabomber.
Oh, it's funny for me to think, not funny, but I like to think about just a couple of different decisions or choices, or if things had gone just a little bit differently, the company that Ted Kaczynski would have built.
Yeah, as a world famous hoodie wearer, he had what is arguably the first step, followed by branded apparel, followed by investors, followed by employees, followed somewhere by revenue, and followed like maybe potentially followed by profitability. Maybe.
Well, I'm being facetious, but there's a kernel of truth. He's a brilliant guy. You know that, right?
I know that he blew some things up.
Yeah, he blew some things up. That's why I said, a couple of decisions got away from him, and some things happened that set him on a different course. But he's a brilliant mathematician.
I'm not sure he used his skills in the best possible way in the end.
Read his story. Obviously,
Is there a definitive version here? Do I need to go past Wikipedia?
there was he just passed away, I think, earlier this year.
I did not know that.
He did. There is a definitive version, but I don't know what it is. So we'll have to connect on that
Refer
offline.
refer me to the definitive Kaczynski, and I'll be sure to check that out in depth.
Yeah,
And then try not to emulate any of the bad things about the guy, and only the good things, like his brilliant mathematical mind.
right. Yeah. It- Multiple things can be true about a person and their environment, and you have to entertain that with him. In that, obviously, he was brilliant. He did have some prescient thoughts on technology, but he also was a madman. And I think there are reasons for that, or at least contributions to that. You just have to read his story.
I'm gonna
You'll have an intake.
until I go read the book, I'm gonna take a black and white view as I am against the Unabomber. So you heard it here first. I'm against Unabombing. But
I'm a
I'm pro hoodie. Firmly pro hoodie. It's actually
I,
making my face too hot. It's quite uncomfortable. Like my face is already feeling a lot of pressure, a lot of infection type of traits. I might have got a sunburn yesterday. I don't know. It's 50 degrees, but I might have got a sunburn on my face. And I'm not what you would call a great example of self care. I'm not a specimen of the pinnacle of peak human performance, unlike yourself. So we're kind of like foils here. And then on top of that, it's like just the oozing. Honestly, if somebody was going to embody a startup founder and somebody was going to embody a madman between the two of us, I gotta say, you've got the startup founder energy and I have the madman energy. No doubt about it. And I also have apparently the wardrobe for it. I didn't know this until the pink eye.
well, you're there are conversations there to be had for sure.
Well, let's ground the startup conversation. You want to talk about startups versus corporations or corporate employers?
So
Do you have more of a lens than that?
yeah, your attire, your aesthetic. You walk into Fortune X100 company X, a company listed on the Fortune 500 list of companies. How quickly do you get ushered out of the building? That's one end of the spectrum. You walk into any startup anywhere, probably in the world, you get exited out of none of them, as long as you're sensible and contributing. And so I think
I think if you show up in a suit with like a particularly a very formal suit, a nice shirt, a double Windsor on your necktie, there are startups that might tell you we're not that kind of company to your face. You
for
might
sure,
feel some hostility there.
for sure, um, for sure that would happen. Not across the board. You would probably across the board get the "What are you doing, dude?"
Have you ever have you worked for both? I've only worked for up to a medium sized company. I've never worked for anything bigger.
And that's what I was hoping. That's why we needed literary guidance on the culture of a startup. Now, I have not worked directly for a startup. I say that smiling yet, but I've worked very closely with startups, and um, yeah. So same with me. I've worked whatever Johnson Controls is well, Siemens. I don't even know if Siemens is listed in the Fortune listing because it's a global company, but I think Johnson is a top 200, maybe
67.
67th globally.
Yeah.
Siemens or Johnson? That
Johnson
sounds like,
Controls.
okay. So yeah, that's the size of corporation that I've worked in.
Uh, Siemens, I can't find as quickly. 47, maybe.
That sounds right, because if I'm thinking about their top line numbers, it feels like Siemens is about twice the size, global revenue about twice the size of Johnson.
I have one pervasive mental. I have a thought about large company, small company, startup versus corporate that I have no idea if it's based in reality or not, and it's sort of a guiding principle. And we should get into that in a second. So first of all, when we're talking about startup versus corporate gig, let's just say corporate is Fortune 500 multinational. Startup is let's narrow this down and say startup is venture backed. So company in the early stages and venture backed.
I think venture backed covers probably, if I'm spitballing, 90% of cases, but there are a fair number of startups that take no venture funding. They self fund as long as they can. And at a certain point, obviously in the Series A or at a certain point, they do a fundraising round, I think, to scale. But there are a number of startups that self-fund initially.
Okay, fair enough. I'll go with your definition here. Investopedia, which I refer to regularly for business and economic definitions because that's what it started out was mostly definitions. They refer to startups mostly by stage of company. So they talk about just being in the first stages of operations. That's it. Startup company in the first stages of operations. So that wouldn't cover venture backed versus self funded versus angel investor versus anything else. It's just early stages of operations. This got me to next the definition for an entrepreneur because when reading about risk and risk tolerance and where the risk and rewards are accrued. So the when you're thinking about a startup, generally we're talking about a company where the founder or set of founders takes a disproportionate amount of the risk and reaps a disproportionate amount of the reward. This led me to entrepreneurship, and Investopedia tells us entrepreneur is an individual who creates a new business, bearing most of the risks and enjoying most of the rewards. So entrepreneur, not all entrepreneurs are founders. All founders arguably are entrepreneurs by that definition.
Quick PSA, 20-second PSA. If you are applying to a job, applying for a role, and for a corporation, for let's call it a Fortune 500 corporation or any corporation, and in the job listing it says operating as a startup within a corporation, do not take that job. That is, you are going to be fired. Do not take that job.
What's the longest run you could have in a job like that without being fired?
Oh man, it could go really fast. Really fast.
No, what's the slowest it could be? Could you make it 18 months before it all comes crashing down?
You might get 2 years depending on how the company is managed, how much they give, how much credence they give to R&D and sort of speculative innovation. And I use that term intentionally. How much leeway they give for sort of non-committed R&D. And if it's generous, then you might make it a couple of years. But um, at a certain point, there's going to be a requirement to start turning revenue dollars out of the Skunkworks project. So run from any job listing that says operating as a startup within the company. It's not going to go well.
I mean, basically, that's code for not everybody inside the company thinks this is a good idea.
100%. Basically, it's code for we're going to buy some lottery tickets, and you, my friend, are the lottery ticket. And when we do the scratch off at a certain point, someone's going to make a decision that this is not the direction that we want to go.
The funny thing about that is I don't get the impression that those types of positions are particularly well paid. So the explanation being, this is experimental. We're trying something out. You need to have a real entrepreneurial approach to this job to be successful. And because it's pre-revenue as a division, we're going to pay you, below market rate for your skills and experience.
So that's the question, though. That is the question that I want to ferret out of this conversation.
Well, if I can get paid Siemens money to do small like A round startup work instead of small A round startup money, I mean, if I have to take a pick between doing the same miserable grunt work of going from 0 to 1 at a tiny startup, making tiny startup money, or at Siemens, I find the appeal of doing that for real Fortune 500 money appealing. But obviously, I have no equity. Like, there's not going to be a stake in the company.
So the only thing that's the same, the only advantage in that scenario that you just explained is that a little bit of the risk has been distilled out by the backing of the Fortune 500 company. That's the only thing. That's the only upside for that scenario. If the company does well, what's best case scenario? That you have 40% of the value at, once real revenue start, assuming that there's tolerance for the company to grow and flourish. And once that happens, what's the most in terms of equity, if the Fortune 500 company has assumed the risk, the capital risk up front, what's the most equity that a founder in that scenario is going to get from potential revenue streams at the end? It's not great.
It'll be bonuses. They won't even structure it as equity.
That's it.
There's no incentive for the company to give you an equity stake. So you have a situation where you may get more salary up front, but without the equity stake, because there is no equity to be had, and because there's no stomach for distributing risk in that particular way from the backer, uh, you are going to trade money today for money in the future. But the whole principle of why you would go be a founder and why you would take the risk of being an entrepreneur is that you're taking on outsized risk in order to get outsized reward as your company gets big and you have an opportunity to have a meaningful ownership stake there.
But this is the crux of why I'm interested in this topic. I don't think that's the reason 99.9% of founders go into that.
I think the reason is compulsion. I think they can't stop.
I think the reason is, I think there are twofold. I think there are two reasons. I think there's a genuine, you're just wired that way.
Yeah,
You're just wired that way to build and to create. I can vouch for that. It's who you are as a person. You want to, you see a problem, you want it, or not even you see a problem. And I think there's a lot of, that's the other side of it. Not all founding or founders are real strategic problem solvers. They just want to be, there's a certain percentage, we don't know what that percentage is, a certain percentage of founders just want to be a founder for founder's sake, and the why doesn't matter. They're just going to do it. And there's a lot of that. But
that's right.
I think the ones that stick are the ones that it's a convergence of the individual trait. They're wired to do this. This is they can't be an employee. They're wired to found, to create, to build. That merges or converges with work ethic. I think that's a given. We talked about that, I think, a time or two. But the big part that merges with, or the big convergence, the other I think major part is they see a problem that needs to be solved, and they're going to go solve that problem. And there's some technical ability, whether in the founder, him or herself, or a hire that they have, or a co-founder. There's a technical ability to build and to solve that problem. That's becoming less important. Microservices, and we've talked a lot about that. But I think at the end of the day, founders who just want to be founders for founders' sake, there's a limited path to success for that. The convergence of all the traits I think are necessary for the ones that build really successful companies, and it's, we just described why. But I would say not so fast on the notion that a founder is wants to solve problems inherently. That's why they're founding a startup.
Do I have to pick a side here, startup or corporate? Because I think I'm willing to, but
Uh,
barely.
I didn't think we were going to pick sides. I think we were just going to try to tease out the differences in culture and the differences in who thrives in which environment. But I'm interested. You're saying you want to pick a side for you, not generally.
I interpreted "choose your fighter" in your words to mean that we were picking sides here.
All right, fair enough.
My fighter, and it's by a hair, because I think that the reality of both sides of this, and of my own general cynicism and contrarian attitude, is, it's waffling, right? Like, there are pros and cons of each. There are pros and cons that are, you can kind of put them in buckets, but there's not one brush that you can paint startup culture with. There's not one brush you can paint corporate culture with. That's one of the reasons why narrowing it down to venture backed versus Fortune 500 is more important than saying, if we're talking about Fortune 5,000 companies versus any kind of startup, because you can get into a narrower little slice of of trying to pick this apart. Because if you're venture backed, you have a very specific set of incentives that may not apply if you are self funded or bootstrapping your company. So, but either way, I mean, for me, it comes down to if I have to take a pick, corporate or startup. My answer is startup, but barely startup, because I've watched a lot of people be really, really unhappy in uh, startup culture, and I have watched a lot of people be really complacent in corporate culture. But complacency and happiness are not necessarily opposed to one another. So it's sort of like, can you be extraordinarily stressed out by a corporate gig? Absolutely. And that's something that I think is a typical hallmark of startup culture is everything's about to fall, everything's moving fast and breaking things. And that imparts a huge amount of stress on the people in that company. But there's no reason you can't have the same sky high stress level at a big corporate gig.
But I think there's a difference. The stress, again, neither of us have formally worked for a startup. So this is a little
I
bit
did.
of
AI did.
AI
And
did.
I did. No, I did. I worked for a startup.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Ah,
I
okay,
worked, I worked
cool.
for a startup I
Oh
liked.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I knew that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I knew that. I knew that. Um, yeah,
I
how
worked for
did
a
I forget
startup who
that?
had a lot of friends that were also startups, and before that, a lot of the people I worked with most closely were at startups. So it was kind of like spread out, little hard to tell the difference between small business versus a pure startup. Then I was like, okay, you're fully at a startup, and then I quit, and now I work for nobody.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is I limited startup experience, but let me
Which still
fix.
that still applies to me. Limited experience.
Well, and none applies to me formal, but I envisioned that the stress level at a startup for me, and again, I think this goes back to how you're wired how an individual is wired. I view the stress at a startup as not stressful. And why? Again, now if I'm struggling to make payroll, there are a lot of things that once you get into it a little bit, I can see would be genuinely stressful when you have other people's livelihoods dependent on you making good choices and being profitable and so on. But the stress at a startup is mitigated by your skill as a person. And if you have the talent to solve problems and the work ethic, the discipline to do that, the stress is more a function of managing time and not necessarily that it's an insurmountable task or else you've not done well planning in your startup phase. And the
All right. So,
corporate,
oh, sorry.
uh,
Go ahead. Finish your
yeah,
thought.
just real quick on the corporate gig, I think there's legitimate stress in a corporate gig from experience because you're faced with things you can't fix. You can't change. Like you can be really, really successful in the little sphere of your corner of your world. But if the broader corporate paradigm is a challenge or a stress that you can't navigate, that's stress because you're just at the whim of inertia in a corporate environment. And I think for me, that's the distinction. You have the ability, you have much more of the ability to impact your success in a startup than you do in a corporation.
I think this is now, without being preachy about this. I think this has the potential to be another great another great disappointment of Terry's. What? So let me ask this as a direct question. Like,
Fair.
what percent of not? I'm not going to say founders. Maybe I'll come back to founders. What percentage of startup employees are above average?
Probably the exact same distribution as corporate.
What
Maybe,
percent?
maybe slightly higher. Maybe
Yeah.
slightly higher.
All right. And what percent of startup founders are above average?
I think they're more in the right tail than average corporate gig.
So uh, that specific piece, like if you become an investor tomorrow, which I think that just means you have enough money to take phone calls all day and offer some of that money to some people. So I don't know about the first part, but to take phone calls all day and offer money to people, you have the skill set for that already. Um, the realization that most of the people that have a new startup are like the distribution is the same as elsewhere, right? So it's not overwhelmingly populated by standouts and bright stars, and it is instead a mix of people that are amazing, people that are terrible, and people that are in the middle somewhere. And that, I think, I assumed for, and I don't want to put my assumptions and my disillusionment onto you, so I'll let you become disillusioned and jaded on your own. But my assumption on at some level was, if you have the motivation to get out there and be a mover and shaker on your own outside of corporate world, there must be something that's a little bit different about you that makes you willing to work a little bit harder, have a little bit of more vision, And I don't know that I necessarily put it up on a major pedestal, but I certainly thought that there was gonna be an inclination that, the better ideas are coming out of startups, and that must mean that the better people are working there. And then the follow on to that was, well, people that are working as investors, like, they must have a lot of financial knowledge about a lot of things. And that it was much more recently that I started to realize that investors know very little about the markets that they're investing in or the companies that they're investing in. And I'm talking about mostly, VCs and private equity type companies here. So realizing that, well, just everybody doesn't know anything, and we're all we're all out here running around like chickens with our heads cut off to some degree. That was kind of the first side of my disillusionment, which was not. It wasn't very. There wasn't a lot of depth to that. It didn't have a lot of meaning. It was more like I thought it was one way. I didn't really have any basis for it, and then I had, a slow realization that basically the logical thing was true, which is that skill and talent and know-how and stuff are distributed across good, medium, and bad, and that's true regardless of which sector you're in or which segment you're in or how you're funding your company.
Agreed. Uh, Generally, as always, I think there are exceptions, and it's a nuanced discussion. I did just read a little article or a thread. Something was talking about. Someone was talking about this was a higher up institutional investor that I don't know how many years back. Um, this person that was the first person article presenter was talking about, and this is someone who works as an tech investment, was talking about this. He was speaking with a higher level institutional investor, and they were talking about Slack, and the higher level institutional investor said, that's a dumb investment, it's going to go away. With Teams, Microsoft owns the enterprise, Teams is going to kill Slack. And this person, the first person, was like, are you kidding me? We all use the tech world uses Slack.
Right.
And the institutional investor said, yeah, you're in a bubble here on the West Coast. The rest of the world uses Microsoft Office, and they are going to crush Slack from an enterprise perspective, which turned out to be the case. So I think as it's a nuanced discussion. If you're talking about garden variety entry level, or not entry level, but garden variety VC, that's also a broad term. I think people, if it were Vegas and they were just losing money hand over fist, you probably wouldn't see the robust VC community that you do. I think there are obviously winners and losers, but I think they're better at it than maybe we realize.
Well, I mean, all the broader the picture you're looking at, the more you're looking for. Somebody described this to me last week, and this is a really smart point. So the thing you're looking for isn't necessarily just product market fit. The thing you're looking for it's certainly not, is the product good. One level further of nuance is product market fit, meaning, is the product good and there's a market for it. Then beyond that, it's what's the size of that actual market, because the size matters. And then if you take all that and take sort of the next further step towards, broad applicability, it's none of these things. It's inevitability, right? And this Slack versus Teams is a perfect example of inevitability. There is the use of Microsoft Office in large businesses around the world is right now inevitable. And therefore, the ability to sell Teams as a head-to-head competitor to Slack into those businesses is also inevitable. Meaning, not necessarily that it's inevitable that Teams will beat Slack. I think that's an overly bold statement, but it is certainly a reasonable bet that Slack will have to penetrate into already existing Microsoft customers, whereas Microsoft will simply have to add on another line item, and inertia is with Microsoft in that case. So
Oh,
the thing
I think that battle's already been settled.
it has
I
been,
think
yeah.
Yeah, I think Microsoft won 63-0. It was a shutout. There are still places that use Slack, mostly in tech spaces, but I think in terms of enterprise penetration, I don't think the addressable market is even. They've got it. They won that, and as far as I know, and again, it's not something I know intimately, but
Well, so this is the piece that was inevitable, is that there was inevitability of Microsoft's ability to go find the next bunch of customers. So yes, looking backwards, we can say Slack has more or less market share than Teams, but the inevitable part was it was inevitable that Teams would copy Slack and gain market share against all other options
so
because of the entrenched base or the installed base.
this is a point that you brought up earlier, and this is what I want to pivot to. It dovetails nicely with what you just said.
Dove it.
Dove it. This is for me. This is the comparison. Obviously, there are cultural differences, and I think a person can figure out for him or herself whether or not that matters. But I think, and I don't think this is either a feature or a bug of either startup or corporations. I think a corporation exists not to innovate. I think the innovation from a corporation has
Yeah.
happened at some time. They exist not to innovate. They exist to build processes around things that have been innovated. And that's
Well, I mean, let's
fair.
let's narrow this down and say they're not innovating on product or service offerings. They may
Correct.
be innovating on other things, but it's not on what the customer is interacting with each day.
Correct. And to get true innovation from a corporation, again, they may have a skunkworks division that does application specific or sort of special engineering projects for end users. But by and large, a corporation is by definition process oriented. Conversely, startups are not process oriented, they're innovation oriented. And their objective is to innovate and to build. Corporations, if they're functioning properly, are evaluating their portfolio against market trends, spotting holes, and then looking to see what other smaller company makes a technology or a service that will fill a portfolio need that they have, and then they acquire or do a JV or some sort of acquisition with those companies. I think, and that for me has been a knowledge evolution point over the past several years. Is I've thought naively for so long, why are corporations not innovative? And it's just not that's not the mission statement of a corporation. The mission statement is to develop scalable processes, sales and marketing processes of existing product, and then to find holes in their portfolio and by and large fill those with the innovators, the
There's a
startups.
main there's a maintenance component too. So if you have consistency of product at a global scale, that's something that's very difficult to do from a startup. There's a lot of cases where the product. I'll stick with product companies and not services for now. But if you have a product that is, evolving to meet the needs of the next customer, particularly if you're selling to other selling to big businesses, it can be hard for the next customer to take a risk on the software or the product that is it was a great fit for the last customer, but that last customer was a market of one. Now it has to expand and be the next biggest size market. So now that the company is adjusting the product on the fly and building the boat as they race it, if you will. And so that change and that inconsistency versus the overwhelming consistency, and I'll stick with product again. So the thing that's special about Starbucks is not how Starbucks tastes. The things that's special about Coke is not how Coke tastes. It's that you're getting that taste at scale, and you're getting the customer experience of buying a thing that is Coke, and it's the same everywhere you are, and it's the same across the world. And it's even if you're buying it in a different market where it's been localized to that particular market, there are some small variations. But the battle between real Coke with cane sugar versus North American Coke with corn syrup, it does have a difference in flavor, but like, come on, it's still just brown fizzy sugar water. And Starbucks is like, it's amazing that they can make a consistent product across the number of cups of coffee that they're making, even if you don't care for that particular product. So the thing that they're doing is getting it to where there's less surprises all the time, and they're doing it for numbers that a small startup, say anybody under 1,000 employees, a company under 1,000 employees can't deliver that experience for the same volume that a Coke or a Starbucks is delivering that experience to.
Which brings me back to choose your fighter. Are you a process person? Are you do you like to um, define processes that deliver these things at scale, as you just very well succinctly explained? Do you like to build processes that deliver things at scale, or are you a builder or a creator in the product sense? Like, do you like to innovate technologies? Do you like to innovate services, and start to scale them as you can, as you have the reach, and then hopefully you can build the infrastructure, and that's the emergence of. I'm fascinated by the companies who turn into unicorns and then turn into the big global behemoths that they become. I'm fascinated by that dynamic, the ability to take innovative technology, but then also build the infrastructure to scale that experience globally, with all the different cultural customs and all the things required to scale something globally. I'm fascinated by that dynamic. That's not a small feat. I mean, it's not a trivial feat.
So I think for 22-year-old me, I'm like startups all the way, right? I care more about the ideas. Don't give me this stuff shirt stuff. I don't need the specialization of you have the sales team, which is different from the marketing team, which is different from the product team, which is different from the engineering team. No, like give me jacks of all trades working in a small tight knit band with everybody having to get their hands a little bit dirty. And I would have told you that was where all the magic is, and everything else is a waste of time. Uh, Fast forward, I mean, I don't know that I'm ever going to be fully interested in a mature corporate structure where my job is to manage people and those people's job is to manage their people. And everybody is pretty far removed from exactly what the product is, as far as, the thing that somebody is buying and using from us. But on the other hand, I'm much more interested now than in the part where you go from scrappy product idea people to how do you make that work on a larger scale. So to directly answer your question, am I a product and idea person or am I a process person? I'm a process person through and through. But does that actually apply in the scope and scale of a mature corporate environment? Probably not. I think about I've had tangential interactions with Siemens for a really long time, and I have in my mind the idea that there is somewhere inside of Siemens a business unit or a team that is building out a new process or working on assimilating a new product that's been acquired or working on an acquisition. And that team may be made up of outstanding players who are all moving fast and breaking things, but still inside Siemens. I haven't actually found that business unit or that team, and nor have I found a place where that business unit or team that exists in my mind aligns with the things that I already know how to do. If I had, I would have just gone and worked there. So I think at this point, my mind is not made up to say that I wouldn't go work in a corporate environment, but I will say that I, for the number of people that are working at the number of large corporate entities, I've found surprisingly few places where you have a highly motivated, highly capable team all pulling the same direction consistently over more than like an 18-month time period. So I end up at like give me startups, and that's where it falls to the startup side. Even though I'm the most process oriented person that would say I prefer startups versus corporate.
Well, I don't think that process oriented and startup are mutually exclusive. I think process oriented talent is definitely needed in startups as well. It's just it's in the prism of building and innovating. and building processes, sort of building the car while you're driving it, I think is the analogy that I would use in for a process person in a startup. Whereas in a corporation, there is process for process sake, and like layers of process and operations and sort of a lot of nebulous roles in corporation. I think this is,
Exactly. Like you have to be, I want to be able to describe what I'm doing. So if I came
yeah.
into a company and they had no internal process documentation before I got there, and then I spent 6 months, 10% of my job was working on internal process documentation. I don't need anybody to say, "Hey, great job on that internal process documentation." The thanks is coming from I existed, I contributed, I saw how it was before, I see how it's smoother now. Pat myself on the back and move on to the next thing, and that would be enough thanks, right? I'd be happy to have seen that happen. And I don't know that that same thing exists so much at a big. I will say I've known a number of people that worked at Amazon, and I've known of other people that have worked at Amazon. And depending on where you are inside of Amazon, they have a reputation for consistently hiring people who then are kind of like backing up the people next to them, and the feeling that I'm doing a great job at my job because I don't want to disappoint Terry, not because I don't want to disappoint Bezos or stakeholder or shareholder or something like that. So building a team where I care about the people next to me, and you're doing a great job and I'm doing a great job, and this creates a reinforcing pressure of let's move faster, let's do a better job, let's hire people quicker, let's be more focused on the fundamental pieces of this business. I've heard that all that stuff exists in certain places in Amazon. I've also heard that there's like extreme hostility and dysfunction in other pieces of Amazon. So, and I don't think right now I don't qualify for working in those parts of Amazon that are doing a good job. I just don't have the right CV for it.
That's another discussion too.
Well, I don't want to make me the story, right? Like, so let's make it more about the companies in general. And I like your distinction between process versus product, and the thought of sitting next to somebody who's complacent about product, but is also going through process for process's sake, and just showing up in the office because that's what you do. Oh my god, that would drain me so much.
The other thing that drains me, and I use that in the active sense intentionally. The other thing that drains me with process oriented corporations is there's no way to measure success in the technical product oriented field because and I say no way is and we've talked about this before in the gulf between, especially digital. I'm gonna backtrack that. Not technical, that's too broad. Digital specifically, there's not an awareness in the vast across the C-suite. I can say this from experience. There's no awareness of how to measure success. What does success look like in the digital space internally? And what does innovation digitally look like internally? There's no way to measure that in corporate America. That skill set doesn't exist.
Have
There's
you seen
way
it coming from a startup or a set of startups or investors?
Oh, so that's for me, the knowledge that I have with startups is that's the number one. Again, things are always rosier from the perspective that, from the external looking in perspective. But the startups that I have experience with, they build there's not a distinction between the process, the way the company operates, and digital. You're just built digitally, like you're built with data collection in mind and using advanced tools in the company in mind, and software is everything. Like you don't have Bob that's been doing it this way in accounting for 35 years that has staked his claim to some manual turf, or there's no tolerance in startups for the old way. Everything is, what's the most efficient way to get this innovation out the door and at scale? What's the most efficient way to ship? Really, that's that term. How do we ship? How do we ship quickly? How do we ship consistently? And the concept of baking in digitally advanced tools and functions, it's just inherent in the culture. Like it's not congratulations, you use the most advanced software tool to solve this marketing challenge. That you don't get a pat on the back for that. That's expected. And I think that's a contrast from corporate America.
It's funny you use the word ship. For a long time when I was working with engineers and software developers as almost exclusively the people, my immediate peers, I had this, and this wasn't my phrase. I borrowed it from somebody else, but it was basically F it and ship it. And that was, the intention of that was a little bit tongue in cheek, but the idea was if you are head down on a project thinking about does it work or not, that is a product oriented approach to making that product work. If you don't put that in front of a customer as fast as possible, the only feedback you're going to get as you go from 80% done to 100% done is going to be from you. So when it's 80% done, that's time to have it in front of a customer or a user, because that feedback you're going to get from them as it's gone out the door, as it's shipped, that feedback is going to be what you use to make sure that it continues getting better as fast as possible. So not worrying about it and hand wringing about the last 20%, that was why I was emphasizing, ship it as the thing. And I think that it's a really key distinction you made about the ability to ship consistently. That's a thing that I think is huge. And I think that I agree with you mostly about that existing disproportionately at startups versus corporate organizations. But I have to ask you. I mean, are there examples on the other side? Are there examples where you've seen that a propensity to ship at the corporate side?
No, no. I caveat that again, digital versus core competency.
Sure,
Core
yeah, that's fair.
core competency, building mechanical. Again, I'm limited to the industrial world, so financial may be different, insurance may be different. There may be other segments or sectors in the economy that are different, but the industrial world, the core competency is building widgets that are typically mechanical systems, whether or not they have software or their chip. They have chips embedded is trivial. They're still mechanical. Companies build products, physical products, the companies that I've worked for. So there are, again, ship there is not a 2-week process. That's
Yeah,
you
I was going to
ship.
say we're talking about lead times that are
Yeah.
really, really long.
Yeah. And you've got supply chain, you're dependent, it's a complex system, first off, but that's core competency. On the digital side, no. I've got I'm just going to say generally, there are digital things, digital platforms, digital systems that have been attempted to that industrial companies have been attempting to build for years, and still can't get them out the door with functionality. And I think that's ship quickly digital, not a thing in corporate America. Ship quickly, relatively speaking, with core competency is more doable. But again, defining quickly is the other thing. But I think I'm making it out. I want to be careful because I think that that is also potentially an Achilles heel for startups, in that there's such a focus on ship and build and product and innovation. It's not to minimize the role that culture plays. And I think if you ask across the board in startups of all sizes, the culture of the company has probably suffered or been minimized and taken a backseat to build, ship, innovate, move quickly, break stuff. And at a certain point, there's a balancing effect where a crappy culture that's been neglected overtakes, is more detrimental than shipping quickly is a positive
Advantageous.
for the company. Correct. And I think that's a potential blind spot for startups, is the ability to build and ship quickly while also fostering and cultivating a culture that's satisfactory and diverse and works for the types of people that you're trying to attract. And I think those two things. It's not to say that shipping quickly is a panacea and is the key. It should be thought of exclusive to culture. I think that's a blind spot sometimes for startups.
All right, I have two direct questions for you. Then I got to go do something about my throbbing face. All right, last two questions. First, um, can uh, is the company culture at a startup set by founder or co-founders?
It should be, and whether intentionally or not is.
Okay, same question, but for publicly traded multinational. Is the company culture of a publicly traded multinational set by top brass?
100%. 100%. And here is the biggest source of dissonance and problem for the top side of the fortune scale size wise now is there are expectations from the street and from capital, let's just say capital, that culture be X
Mm-hmm.
and it be a certain thing,
Yeah.
not a value judgment, an objective assessment. That's somebody else's concern. It's not mine. So there's the expectation that you give the appearance of a culture that is a certain thing, but internally, it's still the 1980s. It's still, they're still savages. And that dissonance is a real problem in corporate America. And I'll be direct about this. You can't play social justice warrior on Twitter or on LinkedIn and have a free for all culturally internally, regardless of what your human resources printouts say. That affects profitability. And I,
I'm very pessimistic about company culture, not corporate, but company culture in general, because you see people that make great strides at company culture. So Tony Hsieh from Zappos is pretty famous for this, and he had a great company at Zappos, and it was top to bottom. Zappos was acquired by Amazon. The Zappos culture doesn't exist anymore. Zappos doesn't exist anymore. It's simply gone, right? And this was not. I wouldn't necessarily. Again, I'm like you. I won't put a judgment on whether it's good or bad that it was gone, but it doesn't exist, and it only existed for a certain window. And my feeling is that generally speaking, the ability to drive a positive culture in company or companies is never going to be long lasting. So you're never going to get a company that is primarily about goodness or kindness or beauty or pick your positive thing. Generally speaking, you're not going to get long-term culture from employers that last that way. And that maybe that's not as true when you look at small businesses. So if I think about, you know, Uncle Terry's restaurant down the street, where you make a breakfast, a place where you're going to sell cat heads and gravy, then maybe that's where you can have a persistent, healthy culture over time. But I don't see it at once you get into, once you get into a certain size of company or size of reach, it all just becomes we're here to make money.
so I think it's independent of size, and we'll close with, or I'll close with, for at least from my side. I think it's independent of size. I think it's whether or not the company is publicly traded. And again, not a value judgment. It's just an objective assessment. And I'll give you my example that I know firsthand. There's a company in New Albany, Indiana, right across the river, called Samtec, Samtec. They make board level interconnects. They would be a competitor to Molex, Amphenol, Tyco. It's a privately held company, rapidly approaching $1 billion, vertically integrated. The owner's name, maybe we'll get lucky one of these days and be able to interview this guy. He is an exceptional dude, just an exceptional guy, an exceptional human being. He's kept it private intentionally. He's kept the company private intentionally, and it is very much embedded in the community, and it's embedded in that they hire here. Obviously, they have to go outside for some very skilled strategic roles, but they hire here, and they're committed to hiring here, and they're committed to growing through the context of staying a privately held company in Southern Indiana. And, some of that may have changed since I was exposed to the company many years ago, but it doesn't appear to be. But I can tell you this about the culture of that company: people are really loyal. Um, Obviously, as you grow higher and higher in revenue, you hire more people, so it changes the dynamic some. But they're a great example of maintaining culture over decades. Um, and I think it has more to do with being privately held than it does the size of the company.
I think that that's something we should dig into in a lot more detail
Yeah.
another
And
day.
another day.
Yeah, let's get into that. I want to come up with a list of examples of privately held or employee owned or B corps, and see, is there are there big companies, $1 billion plus, that are kind of living in a way that the company culture would actually affect, day to day life, and would be a culture that you would want to take home, as opposed to something you want to drop at 5 o'clock and not be part of.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Hope your eye gets better.
It's going to be a couple days, but by tomorrow I should be past dark glasses. So we'll
Yeah.
see then. Leave a teaser. Take care, Terry.
Have a good one, man.